Today we have a great honor to host a distinguished guest, Professor Mosze Idel, who is a professor emeritus at the Department of Jewish Thought at Hebrew University in Jerusalem and a senior researcher at the Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem. He also is a member of the Israel Academy of Sciences and Humanities. He authored several dozen of books and articles, including Kabbalah, New Perspectives, that was translated into Polish, and the translator of the book is here today with us. Welcome. Professor Idel wrote also, among many others, Messianic Mystics, Absorbing Perfections, Kabbalah and Interpretation, or Kabbalah and Eros. Professor Idel lectured at Yale, Harvard, Princeton, Collège de France, and other renowned institutions. He has received numerous prestigious awards, among them the Emmet Prize, the Israel Prize, the Gershon Scholem Prize, and the Jewish National Book Award. Today he will tell us about various aspects of Kabbalah and its different trends. The lecture will last about 1 hour, and there will be half an hour for the questions. The floor is yours.
Good afternoon or evening, I don't know how you'll count it. In 1 hour, I shall attempt to tell you what is Kabbalah, but since we have a lot of time, I shall start with an introduction to Judaism. Only then you can understand what Kabbalah is. So let us attempt to distinguish between 3 millennia. The millennia we just finished, millennia before, and 1 millennia before the 2 earlier millennia. 1 millennium before the 2 earlier. In the first millennium, a major book was written by Jews, which became the most important book in Judaism and maybe also in other religions, and that's the Bible. Actually, a collection of books, which was canonized. And I shall attempt to explain to you what's written in the Bible. Actually, the Bible deals only with 2 major issues. The first one is what to do, what's called the commandments, and what happened in history from the beginning of creation up to a certain moment. So that's the Bible. All the other issues in the Bible are simply marginal. What's not written in the Bible is why it happened. Because the biblical theology is a theology of the divine will, which means what happened in history is the result of the divine will. And the commandments are also an expression of the divine will. So with the will, you don't ask why, because that's the will of God. So we finished 1 millennium. Second millennium, many books were written by Jews, but the most important one is called the Talmud, which I will try to summarize the Talmud also in a simple way. The Talmud is explaining something that is rarely discussed in the Bible, and that is how you do the commandments. The biblical style is very elliptic. You don't know exactly how to fulfill a certain commandment because it's very short. In order to be able actually to perform the commandments, you need a lot of details which are not found in the Bible. Maybe they were found orally, but in the second millennium, Jewish legalistic figures attempted to flesh out the elliptic sentences in the Bible related to commandments. Since there are many commandments in the Bible, hundreds, the Talmud is very, very big. I don't enter now in other treatises written in this period, but that is the outstanding book, representative of an attempt to explain in detail how do you do. If in the Bible it's written, you must have phylacteries. What is phylactery? What's supposed to be there? How do you don the phylacteries? From the Bible, you don't know. The Talmud was not interested in history, meaning that's a very clear decision not to start the history from the very beginning and not to speak about the present history in the second millennium. It's a very important distinction between the Bible and the Talmud. There are parts of the rabbinic literature, that is Talmudic and other literatures, and attempt to fill the gap in the biblical account. Also, it's written that Abraham was going with Isaac to sacrifice him. For sure they spoke something. The Bible is elliptic. In Midrashic or Talmudic interpretation, you have the conversation. But that's not an attempt to write a new history. It's an attempt to, in a way, to reconstruct something that the elliptic aspect of the Bible didn't tell us. So let me summarize the second millennium. The second millennium deals only with one issue, and the issue is how. How you perform the commandments, how it happened, what happened. Not something new, but what happened, let us attempt to understand better. Now we're moving to one more millennium. Now it's very difficult to find one book. Jews started to write a lot. I shall explain in a moment why. So in the millennium that just finished, we have whole literatures, different from the Talmud, different from the Bible, dealing with a lot of other issues. But nevertheless, the Bible plays a very important role, as well as the Talmud. But there are many, many other fields which were not addressed in the Bible or in Talmud. To give you examples, to make it more concrete. Jews didn't write books on philosophy in the biblical period, and didn't write any book in the Talmudic period. Didn't write books on psychology, on mathematics, on grammar, because that doesn't have any real meaning for how to do what you do. The rabbis for sure knew Greek philosophers. Some of them were living actually in the vicinity of the rabbis. They knew Christian theologians like Origenes, living in the center of rabbinic literature in Caesarea. But they were not concerned with the problem of what is God, for example, which is very, very important for Christian theology, also for some Greeks. There was a conscious decision not to discuss those issues that you cannot decide because they are too abstract, transcendental, and they don't actually belong to creation of a certain form of society. To give you an example, the great Greek philosophers created important forms of philosophy. They destroyed Greek society. Greek society disappeared 100 years after the great philosophers died. Rabbis were interested in building a society and not a philosophy. So from this point of view, rabbinic literature is monolithic, avoiding diversity of interest. Now, when we're entering in the third millennium, everything changed. As I told you, rabbinic literature remains still important, the Bible remains still important, but there are a lot of additional forms of literature which emerged in Judaism and rabbinic literature because Jews entered more and more a certain form of interaction with Christian and Muslim theologies and philosophies, and they had to answer questions in debates which were posed to them. So from the rabbinic point of view, these abstract discussions was a failure of nerves. Earlier, rabbis didn't enter such a debate. If they enter such a debate, their answers were very short and saying that's really not an answer. Now we have polemics, apologies, books dealing with what is God, what is the world, what is the soul, what is grammar. And that is a very sharp change in the politics, the intellectual politics of rabbis. Those who wrote those books were rabbis, but rabbis who had to interact. So this is the reason for the new variety of Jewish writing and thinking, which is all the time determined in a way or another by the specifics of a certain place. In a certain place in Baghdad, for example, there was philosophy, so Jews wrote philosophy, and so on. Let me start now to describe what is the background of the emergence of Kabbalah in this millennium. The first contacts, intellectual contacts of the Jews were basically with Greek forms of philosophy, like Aristotle, like Plato, much less others. Despite the differences between different Greek philosophies, there is something in common. And this something in common is religion is a matter of belief, of our understanding correctly what God is. So that's what happened in Christian theology and also in Muslim theology. There are different variations of Greek mentalistic approach, which means that what is more important is not what do you do, but what do you think, or what do you believe, which is a personal issue that rabbis were not concerned before. Before, everyone can believe whatever he believes. That's enough if he's doing with all the others synchronically the same. Now, the emphasis started also in Judaism on the mental activity. From time to time, a little bit emotional activity, and much less on the performance. So this is a very important shift in Judaism in comparison to the first two millennia, which means an erosion in the centrality of the religious performance. When you start with the idea that there is something more important, what do you think correctly? So the question is indeed you must do what you are supposed to do. Maybe you can think correctly without the commandments. So you understand that's a certain danger in adopting a modality of thinking which is abstract for a religion which was very strongly performative. So the entrance of a variety of philosophies in Judaism at the beginning of the third millennium created immediately controversy. Controversies are also in Judaism, rabbinic Judaism, but always the controversy were on how to do. The difference between rabbis, how do you do? But not about how do you think. Now, some rabbis felt that actually what happened by the introduction of the mentalistic assumption, someone is creating new forms of ideals which are abstract and not depending so much on fulfilling of the commandments. I hope I was clear enough. Controversy started very sharply from the very beginning of the century, of the third millennium, and they became stronger. In the moment, the most important book in Jewish philosophy or theology, however you like to call, was written by a very important rabbi in Egypt named Maimonides. He was a very important rabbi, at the same time was also very well educated in philosophy. So despite his rabbinic prestige, he was sharply attacked because people understood what this guy is doing. That is a revolution. So we can see that the reaction understood exactly that we have here not a certain evolution in Judaism. We have here a breakdown. The controversy over the Aristotelian philosophy of Maimonides started in his lifetime and didn't end up to today. All the time it's exploding again and again in different forms. Because here we have a very strong division in what the religion is. A part of the controversies against philosophy helped articulating a new type of religious thinking, which we call today Kabbalah, which means a certain literature written in late 12th century and growing more and more and more important. And this literature attempted first to emphasize the importance of the performance. On the other side, to take in consideration as much as they could also the more abstract aspects. So that's a part of controversy, but a controversy which attempted to say there is a third way, not only just performance, and not only abstract religion. There is a combination, and this combination is actually the gist of Kabbalah. Or to put it in terms we used earlier. If the first millennium is dealing with what happened, and the second millennium, how it happened, or how to do, in the third millennium, the most important question is, why? Meaning, in the moment you have a conversation, dialogue, polemic with someone, you must explain, not what do you do, but why do you do, and why are you different from the other? So the most important question now in the third millennium is, why do you do what you do? To answer that is the will of God is not enough, because you must confront now very sophisticated theologies. You must present your theology. It explains why you keep some form of a very pragmatic way of life, performing a lot of religious acts, which are not explained in the Bible and not explained in rabbinic literature. So you know now what Kabbalah is. Kabbalah is one of the answers to the question why people do what the Bible is saying and how they do in rabbinic literature. Now I would like to explain to you what is the Kabbalistic answer to why. The basic strategy used by the early Kabbalists since late 12th century in southern France and more in Spain is to assume something like that. We have a theology and we have a way of life. The two are not different, but they are to be understood as a certain synthesis. What you do has an impact on the divinity. That's something which is very difficult at the beginning to absorb, but I shall try to explain to you. The assumption of the philosophers was that for sure we need some form of law, because society needs arrangement. Otherwise the philosophers don't have a way to think about it. But the laws are inferior. And they are only a preparation to something higher, which is the ultimate goal. That is creating an inferior status to performance. People can say, look, I can understand better without doing anything. I can contemplate all my life, and that's fine from the religious point of view. That's what happened in Greek philosophy, basically. That's why the society disappeared. Kabbalists didn't want to admit such a subordination of the performance to theology. They created theology which depends on performance, and performance which depends on theology. That now I should attempt to explain. Unlike Greek philosophers who assumed a very static vision of the divinity, God is the one perfect, immobile, to a great extent even passive, ideal being, transcendental, from time to time unknown. The Kabbalists adopted a complex vision of the divinity, which combines philosophical aspects with what we would call anthropomorphic aspects, like the Bible. So God is not just one static entity, but it is a series of powers which interact with each other, and what is more important, interact with our performance. So that is the strategy used by the Kabbalists, and I shall attempt to explain more now. First, you can say that is a surprise. Jews who are monotheistic, that all the people believe, that we also believe for sure that Jews are monotheistic, came with a theology which includes at the beginning some 10 divine powers, and with the time it became who knows how many, thousands, which is a quandary if you look to Judaism as a monotheistic religion. However, for the rabbis, that was not the question. That is a modern question, maybe a Christian question, maybe a philosophical question, but it's not a Jewish question. Because Jews didn't have a term for monotheism. Even in Hebrew today, we don't have a term. No term. In Hebrew, you say monotheism. Why? Because that was not so important. For the Jews, what was more important, the biblical Jews and the rabbinic Jews, was that God is an active factor which intervened in history. The redemption of the Jews from Egypt, for example. That is the major dimension of theology in the rabbinic Judaism and the biblical Judaism. Our question is not if God is one or there are many. We are worshiping that God which cared for us and saved us in the most important moments in the history of the Jewish nation. So the Jewish God was a God of the Jews, which doesn't mean there are not other gods, but that's not ours, and we don't worship them. If you like to call it monotheist, you can call it monotheist. You can call it monolatry, you can call it by a variety of names, but that seems to me to be the most important aspect of the biblical theology, which is the active divinity, which cares and enters history. He's not perfect, as you can see from reality, but he is very active. So the Kabbalists took the active aspect from the biblical and rabbinic literature, and the rabbinic literature God is a little bit less active. He's still, how to put it, looking down to see what's happened here. He doesn't create again. He put all the responsibility on us, but he is not transcendental. For example, the most important activity of the God in the rabbinic literature is, you will be surprised, he is a shadchan, meaning attempting to create couples. Something very, very difficult, only God can do. So that is the way in which the rabbis described what God is doing after he gave us the commandments. Now it's up to us, but he must do something. So he's attempting now to create couples. This divine dimension of activity and caring about what's going on to the humans was carried into Kabbalah. So God is transcendental, but not so transcendental. So from this point of view, that's a very different vision than Greek philosophy. Greek philosophy cannot allow something like that. God knows the individuals. That's not sublime enough for the philosophers, like Plato. He's a paradigm of what happens here, but he doesn't know what's going on here. The Kabbalists wanted to save this active divinity, which is interactive. And at the same time, they wanted to confer on the commandments a very important role. So they created some form of synergesis between divine powers and what do you do. So if you have many divine powers, it's easier to explain why there are so many commandments. Very difficult to understand why 613 commandments are needed by one God. But if you have an active system with many powers interacting all the time, in a moment I shall explain more, so that becomes a little bit more logical. Each power, divine power, needs another commandment in order to improve the interactions. So that is, in my opinion, the most important innovation in Kabbalah, which is an attempt to save the dynamic activity, conferring on the commandments a role which is much more important than the philosophers did. Which means, if God, and that is, how to put it, a very strong emphasis that should be read, God needs human activity. Meaning, performance is not a personal story. If I don't perform, I shall go to hell. So it's a personal problem. Now, it became different. If I don't perform a commandment, God is suffering. So that is, in my opinion, the most important innovation in Kabbalah, which explains why we do what we do. We do because God needs it. Philosophers couldn't say something like that. That will immediately create a problem of the static, perfect God and the need to man. That you can see in a more simpler way explained in the books of Avraham Yeshua Heschel. I'm sure that some books are translated here, and he emphasizes a lot. So here we have a strategy which attempts to save two important dimensions of biblical and rabbinic forms of Judaism: an active divine, an active human, but now they must be coordinated, which means you cannot perform the commandments without understanding what is the meaning, special meaning, the specific meaning of this commandment that interacts with one divine power or another. Because if you don't understand, the effect of the commandment is not so great. I hope that I explained to you now why. That is the answer to the question why. For sure, Kabbalists adopted also philosophical issues. They spoke in the language of the medieval period, which includes a lot of philosophical terminology, but this terminology was strongly adapted to what I told you, to the dynamic. From time to time, that's a misunderstanding of philosophy. But they had to speak a language that is understood by the intelligentsia. And that's why they adopted in their system a variety of important philosophical terms, almost always distorted. Because they distorted it for their purposes, we have at the same time a very strong creativity. To a very great extent, philosophy in the Middle Ages, and a little bit before, is very scholastic. The problem is what Aristotle intended. And you have many, many commentaries on Aristotle. Kabbalists were not so interested exactly in what Aristotle thought, but they adopted from Aristotle whatever they could take and change it, even distorting it, in order to create their system. So from this point of view, the Kabbalists were capable of being creative despite the fact that they were distorting. While the philosophers attempted to be as faithful as they could to Aristotle, but that collapsed at the end of the Middle Ages with the Renaissance, when people left the scholastic philosophy because it couldn't be relevant to them. Kabbalah only started to be more important from the Renaissance because of the emphasis of the importance of man and his activities. So that is the major line which can be discerned since late 12th century, and that became stronger and stronger all the time. What is the meaning stronger and stronger? We have books which offer details of the theosophical or theological system, which was the time they became, at the beginning, we have small books. The 16th century, we have volumes. Rabbis never wrote commentaries on why to perform the commandments. They wrote about how to do the commandments. But from the 13th century, we have a new genre, which is rationals, explanations. What is the meaning of each commandment from the point of view of the relationship to the divine power? So we can see this attempt to explicate the divinity more and to offer a certain raison d'etre for the different commandments. Each of them has another meaning. And with the time, those genres dealing with the nature of the divinity and the nature of the commandments became longer and longer and longer, up to whole volumes. Something which is very different from rabbinic literature. The people who wrote them were rabbis, but that was part of their other activity. We did not conflict with their rabbinic views. There's something new from the point of view of answering another question, but that's not a question which is in conflict with the classical rabbinic literature. So that is a major line. However, Kabbalah became more and more diversified. At the end of the 13th century, we have already other forms of Kabbalah which are not important from the point of view of attempting to answer the question why, but they offered a totally different vision of divinity and of man. So if the major line I described earlier can be called theosophical because we have a complex theology, and theurgical because what you do has an impact on the divinity, other Kabbalists went in a different direction. They attempted to become what we call in the West mystics, meaning interested much more in some form of direct relationship to God, not via performance, but via a certain form of intellect, intellectual activity, emotional activity, spiritual activity. So here we can see an even stronger influence of Greek philosophy, because those forms of mental, intellectual contact did not need the rabbinic forms of activity, but those Kabbalists created what can be called mystical techniques, ways to shorten the way to a direct contact with the divinity, not using the commandments, or at least seeing the commandments as something different. It doesn't mean that they didn't fulfill the commandments, we don't know. But the major vehicle from the religious point of view was mystical techniques. Those techniques have earlier Jewish sources, which I cannot enter here, but they were enriched by adopting a variety of Sufi issues, what can be called Hindu yoga, techniques of breathing, visualization of colors, a variety of techniques, which offer to a certain extent a competition with the rabbinic way of life, even if they didn't want to do so. It was a short circuit to the divinity. So that doesn't mean that the Kabbalists who attempted to be a mystic wouldn't perform the commandments, but the commandments were not the major vehicle. The other vehicle during night, let's say, was something different. That's an individual experience. And while the commandments were performed in rabbinic literature in public, coordinated synchronically with other Jews, the mystical techniques are done by individuals at their time without any form of regulation, basically during night. And here we have a beginning of an alternative, a mystical alternative to the Kabbalistic emphasis on the commandments. So those two schools were already articulated, elaborated clearly at the end of the 13th century in Spain. And Spain was the most important center in the 13th century, a little bit 14th century. And then Kabbalah started to radiate in all the directions. Northern Africa, Italy, a little bit in German Ashkenazi literature, and slowly to Byzantine Empire, and then Ottoman Empire, up to the land of Israel. Meaning we have a process of dissemination of schools which were forged first in Spain. And by moving to the other centers, Kabbalah diversified itself even more. Because there were different interactions with different circumstances. And we can speak about a variety of Kabbalistic schools, which should be understood as a result of first radiation from Spain, being encounters with other cultures. I shall enter here only in one major type of radiation because it's better known and more important also. To give you an example, late 13th century, Kabbalah arrives to Italy. With the time, we have a form of Kabbalah which disappeared in Spain and became more and more important in Italy. There was a schism, in fact, between Spanish Kabbalah and what happened in Italy. In Italy, there were what Italy of today, meaning then that was a little bit different. Then it started in Rome and then in Sicily. Sicily was Spanish, but largely speaking, we're thinking about Italy. With the time, the more mystical form of Kabbalah, I shall refer to it as the ecstatic form of Kabbalah, became more important in Italy. And at a certain moment, around 1480, we see the first major effort of translation of Kabbalah into Latin. A Jewish convert to Christianity, Flavius Mithridates, translated, in fact, almost a library into Latin, from Hebrew into Latin. And that became one of the most important moments in the emergence of what is known today as Christian Kabbalah. Meaning, he translated it for people who had money to pay, for sure. He didn't do it for gratis. And people complained that it cost a lot of money, but nevertheless, we have such a library. It was consumed by one of the most important figures in the history of the Renaissance, Giovanni Piccola Mirandola, who read those translations and adopted a part of them, writing, how to put it, what can be called the beginning of Christian Kabbalah, an issue which was dangerous. Actually, he had to leave Italy in order not to be arrested by the Inquisition. So that was something new, a certain openness toward forms of Judaism, which is not known before, which is part of the openness of the Renaissance figures also to pagan philosophy, which was translated Plato, Plotinus, meaning that's coming at the same time. Pagan philosophy on one side, Kabbalah on the other side. But from time to time, they are actually exactly in the same circles, in the same places, if you're in Florence. So here we have an example of how Kabbalah changed. What's the meaning changed? Christians couldn't adopt the importance of the commandments. So out of the blue, a major dimension, maybe the most important dimension of Jewish Kabbalah was eliminated. And Kabbalah turned to be then a theology. What remained from this erasure of the commandment is the complex theology 10 sfirot, you know what is higher, what is lower, some form of issues that for a Jewish Kabbalist will be meaningless, because to know divinity doesn't mean anything if you don't interact. In Christianity, it took the form of one more theology. For them, it was an important theology because people believe that Kabbalah is very ancient. Like Plato, maybe before Plato for them. But it is nevertheless a theology. They adopted a little bit some techniques, but not commandments. And here we have a development, which is a dramatic development of Kabbalah, which is still going on today, that the Christian world was ready to learn something not found in Christian sources. Doesn't matter how they distort those writings, but that created a certain form of interest, which has more than one dimension. One dimension is indeed intellectual openness. Other dimension is, let us use Kabbalah to convert the Jews. Let's use techniques of interpretation found in Kabbalah in order to show the Jews that Christianity is in fact right, according to their own forms of interpretation. That includes also the great humanist Giovanni Piccola Mirandola. So this development is complex, and I would like not to enter now too much because I would like to go beyond it. That late 15th century, 16th century is full of Kabbalistic writings in Italy, in Germany, in France, and a little bit in England. A huge literature that up to this day we don't have a bibliography. It's so big, almost everything in the manuscripts, and still we don't know how many books and who wrote them, because that's in manuscripts. So that's a major development of Kabbalah, going from Spain outside, adopted by others, taking new forms and having influences beyond circles of Jewish elite. Another development. After 1492, Jews were expelled from Spain, and 1496 from Portugal. Jews moved eastward. So some of them arrived to Italy, and they disseminated Kabbalah in Italy. But some of them moved more to east, to two major cities, one Jerusalem and the other one Safed, where we can find circles of Spanish Kabbalists, Jewish Spanish Kabbalists, which created a new renaissance in the history of Kabbalah. Meaning, we're speaking in something like 60 to 17 years in a literature which, again, we don't know how large it is. Tens of thousands of pages. A great part printed, still a lot of manuscripts. A part of this renaissance is related to the feeling of the returning to the source of Kabbalah, the land of Israel. Because the Kabbalists assume that Kabbalah is ancient, was written in Jerusalem or not far away from Safed. And in a way, they explain the expulsion as a return to the source. That's why I'm saying Renaissance. And they started to create in an incredible way, from the point of view of numbers of books and the volumes of the books. Every book is something like hundreds of pages. So we have a renaissance of Kabbalah that can be seen also an answer to Christian Kabbalah. Safed was Ottoman Empire. Turks were there. But the real, how to put it, reservoir from the intellectual point of view. Spain didn't exist more from the Jewish point of view. Was what happened in Italy. There were a lot of Kabbalists in Italy and Christian Kabbalah in Italy. For the Kabbalists in the 16th century, Christian Kabbalah is a distortion, but a distortion was disseminated in print. And even Jews started to read Christian Kabbalah. So what happened in Safed, in my opinion, is an attempt to offer the alternative to the distortion, the pure Jewish Kabbalah, to serve as a counterpart to what happens in Italy. So what happened in Safed up to between 1540 and 1575, a new center was created, which became the most important center in the history of pre-modern Judaism, which established ways of life according to Kabbalah, still part of Jewish rituals today, instituted Zen, and adopted in Jewish rituals. But in Safed we have also grandiose theologies, meaning books of theology that every book is 400 or 500 pages, but what do I mean a page? So here we have an attempt now to articulate what the Kabbalists believed is implicit in the Bible and in earlier Kabbalistic writings, but there, according to the Kabbalists, it's very obscure. Now we write commentaries. And those commentaries explain what is the secrets of Kabbalah, which is a very important turn toward exotericism. If Kabbalah was esoteric, hidden for the few, in Kabbalah, in Safed, we have a whole move, a project, actually to disseminate Kabbalah in larger publics. That's why they wrote so much. And that became, in fact, a new phase in the history of Judaism, when Kabbalah moved from small circles to larger circles, and then continuously to larger and larger circles. And in those handbooks, if you like, Kabbalistic handbooks written for, not for the elite always, but for more regular people, not ignoramuses, but for regular people, we have an infusion, in fact, of a more mystical way of life into regular Jewish life. Kabbalists became, from the patrimony of small circles, it became, in fact, the most important spiritual source for Judaism up to today. To be fair, many people didn't like it, and still today people don't like it. There were still Jews who adopted the more Aristotelian, rationalist vision of Maimonides. That's still going on today. But more and more, we can speak about the victory of Kabbalah in larger circles, despite the ongoing controversies. Those controversies never stopped. And I must say, I'm not a representative of Kabbalah, but for the sake of discussions, I had some controversies with Maimonideans today. I don't know if you heard the name, Yeshayahu Leibovich. He was Maimonidean. So that's an issue that never stopped. They're not going to stop. Because that's two different types, two paradigms which enter Judaism. But it's quite clear that the dissemination of Kabbalah became acute for understanding the later developments of Jewish life and also of Jewish history, because we have messianic movements inspired by Kabbalists. And then we have a later form of dissemination of Kabbalah known as Hasidism, which is one more stage of dissemination, which actually changed religious life in Eastern Europe, which is just one phase in this radiation of Kabbalah from Spain to Safed, from Safed to the entire Jewish world. At the same time, we have a dissemination of Kabbalah in larger public, Christians or whatever, atheists even. And that's what we know today in the last generation, which is part now of a change in the West when the ideals of the Enlightenment, which are Greek, Maimonidean, German philosophy, disappeared or were attenuated. And you may remember, if you remember, once people were speaking about yoga and transcendental meditation, true? Now people forgot about them. Now that's Kabbalah coming after them. And we can see, in fact, now a dissemination of Kabbalah beyond Judaism, in circles that no Kabbalist ever dreamt to believe that people will be interested in Kabbalah. To finish with a very, very, very recent example. All over the world you have centers of Kabbalah. For sure you must have one here. It's impossible not to have one or more. But the latest center of Kabbalah was created in Beirut. You can imagine? People claim that's not Judaism. It has nothing to do with Judaism. But Kabbalah is something detached from Judaism, to save the center from attacks. So the claim is now we're teaching Kabbalah without any connection to Judaism. So what I told you about Kabbalah being a development in Judaism is true, but today we have totally different attitudes with people who don't know what Judaism at all, but they believe that they know what Kabbalah is. Thank you very much. So, if you have some questions, I answered all the questions. What and how and why. But if you have other questions, actually. Yes.
Hi.
Yes, that, I don't know how it's going to work.
Hi, I will try to rely. Can you hear me? I'm here. Yeah, just here. Oh. Yeah. No. I'm going to ask you a question. I will try to rely on my shaky English. Can you hear me or not? Can you hear me?
Can you hear?
I mean, if the gentleman cannot hear me, how can I go on? Far out. Now, I want to ask a question, but the guy doesn't seem to hear me. He doesn't seem to hear me. Come on. Just let me ask me the question. I will ask the question. Okay. If you want to ask the question, you will be next.
Please do.
Holy moly. So I have a simple question. What you have just said is a basic immoral idea. There are millions of people around the world who claim that they are receiving secret messages from a supernatural force. Call it what you will. I mean, it's such an immoral concept. How can anybody around the world claim that they are receiving? It's unverifiable. How can anybody claim to another person, another human being, that they are receiving a kind of secret message? And come on, listen. So don't interrupt, because it's a serious stuff. Holy moly! Just concentrate because it's a serious stuff. So whenever somebody is telling another human being that they are receiving a message from a supernatural being who then expects us to behave in a certain way, and if we don't, we will be punished or awarded, It's such an inhumane concept. It's so unethical, immoral. So Kabbalah is nothing new. There are millions of ideas like this around the world. So, yeah, if you can answer the question.
So you hear me? So that's a very good question. A basic question. Meaning it's a statement, but also a good question. It's a moral question. So okay. That's a statement. Yeah. It's a statement. Up to, let's say, 18th century, all the forms of mysticism we know are particularistic, written in a certain specific language. Greek in Pravoslav Orthodoxy, Latin, or a little bit Spanish in Catholicism, and then vernacular a little bit. All of them are speaking about personal revelations, which were important for a certain person, and not universalistic. I think that is the case in, I would like not to exaggerate, in most of the forms of mysticism. There are other forms of quasi-mysticism which are more universalistic, like Freemasonry, which have a claim of universal. They took from Kabbalah also. You remember Christian Kabbalah? That arrived to Freemasonry. Meaning, your question is a good question, but in wait, I shall answer.
Please.
There's nothing like moral or immoral. People are. I am ready to answer. You don't want to give me to answer. Look, humanity was divided up to very recently in different forms of religion, and people were all the time quarreling and dividing themselves and fighting themselves. That's Kabbalah, or that is humanity? So that's what happened. Okay, Kabbalah is part of this. Okay, no problem.
Okay, thank you very much. We have a next question here.
Okay. Professor?
Okay,
Professor, you said a very interesting thing for me, that the Safed, there's the Arizal circle of Kabbalists. It was somehow a conscious attempt to counteract the Christian Kabbalah. Yes, the Italian Christian Kabbalah. This is a quite new thing for me. What kind of the data, yes, the text data, historical data, you can give more to support this?
Okay. Christian Kabbalah is not only a matter of data.
Okay.
We don't know how many thousands of books. Some of them in print already in the 16th century. I'll give you titles if you like. That's what was in print. What's the manuscripts we still don't know. That's not some Christians studying Kabbalah. We're speaking about a movement which printed hundreds of books and produced thousands of books in Latin and a little bit later in vernaculars. You can read them in any library. I mean, sure, if you're going to the library, you like to see what is Kabbalah. So you can find 19th century a guy who didn't know too much Kabbalah, named Eliphas Levi, who wrote some books, and a lot of people were influenced by him. And they believe they are Kabbalists. That's just an example. I can give you tens of names of people who wrote books, were printed, were consumed. That's Christian Kabbalah.
Yes, but if I understood you properly, how do we know that the Safed, the Kabbalist center, was also a conscious attempt to counteract, like you said?
They didn't know.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
They simply didn't know. They produced they were not interested in something in the Ottoman Empire.
Mm-hmm.
Safed is not Italy. It's not Germany.
Okay.
And they didn't cope with the Safed Kabbalah, on the contrary, in the 17th century, started to translate part of Safedian literature in Latin. That's a huge book. In the 17th century, Kabbalah Denudata, the Kabbalah revealed. You won't believe how many Western philosophers studied this book. From Leibniz up to Kant and Hegel.
Okay, thank you.
We have the next question here.
I have a question concerning a reception of Maimonides. You mentioned Leibovich, and you mentioned some people who don't agree with Leibovich, and Leibovich don't agree with them. So my question is how you decide to adopt a certain way to philosophizing or theologizing. Is a psychological or temperamental question, or that, in other words, my question is concerned with the possibility to have a dialogue with people who have a different approaches toward Kabbalah, for example, or Judaism as a way of living.
It's simple and difficult. First, I am not inspired by Kabbalah. I'm not inspired also from philosophy. I believe they are old forms of thinking, that people who had some spiritual vacuum adopt them. So from this point of view, my answer to such a question is, I hope that I am not influenced by Kabbalah at all. I am also hoping that I am not influenced by Leibovich at all. Because that's Aristotle with a little bit how to beat Judaism. So I don't have a problem how to think, because I attempt to think modestly by myself without attempting to say that I am following the Kabbalah. Many people are asking me if you are influenced by Kabbalah, and that's the answer. I hope no. So I don't have a personal problem. The problem is how do I speak with them? It's also very simple. With Leibovich, I had a technique. For him, Kabbalah was idolatry.
Yeah.
Very nice. So I started to ask him one after the other. Tell me, Nachmanides was a Kabbalist? He had to say yes. Joseph Kara was a Kabbalist, had to say yes. The Gaon of Vilna was a Kabbalist, had to say yes. I thought, okay, you are a small minority. If you like to remain a minority, I have no problem. But you must recognize that all the other Jews, with your exception, are idolaters. He recognized that is, okay. So it was easy to answer to Leibovich. And then we did it several times. He knew that I'm going to ask him the same question, and there's no way to escape.
My question is, can you imagine what will be the after what, how, and why? What will be the question for our millennium, the fourth one?
Look, you are asking me the question of our millennium. For sure, that's a prophecy, and prophecy is from many points of view stupid. But to a great extent, that is going to be with a certain form of feeling, rather than fulfilling commandments or thinking. That's some form of new age, because Kabbalah is going to change in the new centers. And that's going to take some less mentalistic forms and less performative forms. What remains is an emotional form. So Madonna, for example, she doesn't fulfill all the commandments, true? She's not a great philosopher, true? So what is she? Someone dealing with a little bit emotions. Her emotions, our emotions. So that is Kabbalah.
There's a question there. I think, yes.
Now we'll have a very difficult question, you'll see.
I will try to make it, the simplest, the simpler way, the better, because I have tendency to make it more complicated.
Can you speak louder?
Yes, sorry. So one part of your presentation of your lecture was about the influence on external world, non-Jewish world of philosophy, of Christian thinking, and one philosopher that comes to my mind is Leibniz, claiming that we are living in one of the best possible worlds, and this idea is pretty known, pretty common. For someone that read a little bit of Kabbalistic literature, it's obvious that this is stemming from, at least from Zohar, which is dealing with the idea of worlds that are preceding this world. That there were a chain of several worlds that were destroyed and recreated, and then destroyed and recreated. And this is there is such a claim in several seminars I've heard about it, that Leibniz took the idea from Zohar, or at least from similar works, maybe from Sefer Tmuna, but Zohar is here, would be the best source. So my question is, Leibniz being this obvious, first of all, if the claim is valid from your point of view, if you believe that this is possible, let's say, chain of influence to have this idea in Leibniz. And the second thing, if there is another philosopher that comes to your mind that is obviously influenced by Christian Kabbalah for sure, or no, of course, not talking about Spinoza, but let's say something that comes to your mind as a similar example. Thank you.
Look, Leibniz is a very good example for the influence, because he was not a Christian Kabbalist. He was a philosopher. But then to study Kabbalah was en vogue. It's not only today. It happened also in the time of Leibniz, and that we are 100% sure that he studied Kabbalah. We have his handwriting, notes he took from Kabbalistic books. We have them. It's the whole book written about Leibniz and Kabbalah, a very good book in my opinion, written by a Christian lady, very good scholar, Leibniz and Kabbalah. Now, Leibniz was a philosopher for whom it was not important at all commandments. He was interested in cosmology. Kabbalists were also interested in cosmology, but not so much. But as a philosopher, he took something from Kabbalah, distorted it a little bit, and created a system. I can explain you exactly how he took and what he did, but that I don't have the time. But that's an example. He's not the only philosopher who studied. I mentioned some. I shall mention one more that I didn't believe that's possible. This lady who wrote the book on Leibniz gave a lecture in Arizona, and she told me, I'm going to speak about John Locke and Kabbalah. I thought that's a joke. That's impossible. She brought manuscripts of John Locke, who studied Kabbalah. So it doesn't mean that he was a Kabbalist. It doesn't mean that he was influenced. But that was part and parcel of the elite in Germany, especially in Germany. And that is up to Hegel. That there were German Kabbalists, Johannes Reuchlin, who wrote important books in print. They could read them. They read some of them. That they only rarely liked them, but they were influenced from time to time. To give you an example, I believe the most important issue in Hegel, his dialectics, were taken from Kabbalistic books. I wrote a book about it, but it's only in Italian. But to give you an example, this is not studied enough, because the assumption is that Kabbalah is something totally different. While Kabbalah disseminated in Europe much more than we dream. But since there are not scholars, enough scholars to deal with it, we simply don't know. So at the beginning, Leibniz and Kabbalah was a quandary. Maybe yes, maybe no, maybe it's an exaggeration. And now we know, no exaggeration. We have the materials he studied in his handwritings. Newton, say Newton has nothing to do with Kabbalah. It's many manuscripts in Jerusalem, handwriting of Newton, and so on. Meaning, we are at the beginning of understanding that there was a fashion, not now, already then, which doesn't mean that all of them were Kabbalists, or all of them were understanding what they read. And even when they were influenced, they distorted it, just as the Kabbalists distorted other issues. So in general, I would like to say, culture is a matter of distortion. Otherwise, it wouldn't advance. So the Kabbalists offer an attractive distortion. And many other people distorted it also. And today you have the biggest distortion of Kabbalah all over the world. Everyone is distorting Kabbalah, including myself.
We have a question here.
I have a question about gematria. How it appeared in Kabbalah and how it was incorporated and from where and when. Do we know something about? And if it was incorporated from other languages, how can you describe Hebrew meanings by different cultural tradition?
First, very difficult to answer a question today. Some years ago, it was simpler. Apparently, gematria doesn't play an important role in rabbinic literature, but it exploded in 12th century, not in Kabbalah, in Ashkenazi literature, and then entered Kabbalah. However, the sources are very ancient, pre-biblical. In Assyrian literature, you have a lot of gematria, a lot, which means it entered Jewish culture but didn't become prominent. At a certain moment, it became prominent, and the Kabbalists are not those who are using gematria so much in comparison to other Jews, like Ashkenazi Jews, who had some form of predilection toward calculating and finding secret relationship between things which are different. So that's not a Kabbalistic invention, and that's also not a Jewish invention. We know it from Kabbalah because no one is reading cuneiforms, and you don't know that it's found there, even more. The role played by gematria is still not so clear because we don't have studies about it. We have millions of gematria, but there is no serious classification. How many types of gematrias are? You see, gematria is one story? No, that's who knows how many different forms of calculations called gematria. Then we don't know what are the cognitive processes related to finding secret relationship between things which are different by numerical calculation. Simply, we don't have studies. Kabbalah is only at the beginning of being researched. The numbers of manuscripts in Kabbalah is huge. Numbers of scholars of Kabbalah is very small. And the numbers of good scholars of Kabbalah is almost maybe 10. So we have a literature of maybe 10,000 books, half of them in manuscripts. Some of them no one read them. We don't know who wrote them. So there are issues that I cannot answer in a responsible way.
Are there any more questions?
So my question is about the special role of Kabbalah in common beliefs. So Kabbalah is the thing that almost everyone have opinion on. Like we heard in the first question, it's sometimes very emotional, But even if it's not emotional, it's a very symbolic thing. So everyone knows or pretends to know something about Kabbalah, pretends to think that he knows what Kabbalah is. And do you have any idea how Kabbalah became such a symbolic thing, sometimes fixed with Judaism, sometimes even not, like nowadays? So do you think it's the influence of Safed school, or it's just the nature of something secret, mysterious, esoteric?
Look, would someone ask me, what is philosophy? I would say, I don't know. There are many forms of philosophy. Hindu, Chinese, in Europe there are some 100 forms of, and I don't know. Imagine that Kabbalah is parallel to it. There are many schools and many developments in many places. I attempted to give you an example here, but that's just one example. So it is too early to answer really what Kabbalah is, because Kabbalah is not one essence, but it's a variety of developments, coexisting, quarreling. Many Kabbalists excommunicated others. So how do you know who is right and who is wrong? So it's a little bit too early to answer to your question. Maybe in 200 or 300 years we'll know a bit more. But you know, there is someone who can tell you what is philosophy. No one can tell you. You say, look, you think about one philosophy. You believe that is philosophy. That's also Kabbalah. You believe that what you read in a certain book is Kabbalah. Take another book, you'll see that's different. So we are speaking about a very complex phenomenon that is used, in fact, abused by people to sell their idiosyncratic vision for money. They don't care what is written in the books. They are interested in what the public would like to listen to. And then Kabbalah became astrology. It became magic. It became alchemy. Everyone creating some form of synthesis, which is answering the demands of a certain public in a certain time. Do you believe Madonna will study Kabbalah, really? She was told exactly what she wanted to know.
My question is more about, I mean, Judaism have a lot of things which are not the one way of thinking, which are a lot of varieties of thinking, even in Talmud, which is not so modern, not so attractive to modern researchers. It's variety of opinions. So it's about many things in Judaism, because it's not the nature of one state, one pope who will say what is good and what is not. So the question is then, do you think why Kabbalah was the thing which is so attractive for the people who don't know Judaism to take and to interpret it in their own way?
I answered the question very shortly, but I shall elaborate. Kabbalah became attractive only after yoga and transcendental meditation. After the weakening of the Enlightenment, people remained without ideologies. In a way, desperate people. If you would visit Los Angeles in 1980, the most important place you're going to be taken would be Malibu, Buddhist, Jewish Buddhist, other Buddhist. Who is going to Malibu today? It was a fashion. That's also a fashion. Why is a fashion? Intelligent people were clever enough to be able to sell it. Just as the Buddhist monks came and they disseminated it, and they became important figures, and still you can see Dalai Lama going. Also, some Jews thought that, not a bad idea to make a small competition. So it worked. Why it worked, you don't have to ask me. You must ask those people who are consuming it.
I think, yeah, there's a question downstairs.
I have a very simple question. You said that we are at the beginning of understanding what Kabbalah is. And you are teaching Kabbalah, aren't you? You are? Teaching in Jerusalem Kabbalah, what Kabbalah is. How can you teach if you are at the beginning of understanding what Kabbalah is?
How do you teach science? We are also the beginning. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
I would like to piggyback on the previous question because it seems to me important and interesting. You said philosophy. Somehow it's not common that it's not a common view that a gang of philosophers are going to grab the power and rule the world and bring the world to the end. However, a cabal of Kabbalists, especially a cabal of Jewish Kabbalists, who stand behind all of this. And can you offer an explanation for this phenomenon?
Look, the most interesting distortion of Kabbalah I didn't mention. So the great distortions of Kabbalah is as follows. The term Kabbalah means numerology. If you're going to Southern America, you'll see Kabbalah everywhere. I didn't understand at the beginning why, when I'm coming to Buenos Aires, Kabbalah is written everywhere. It was Lotto. And then it became, in French and Germany, it became a term for intrigue, for some form of conspiration, which is called Kabbalah. That's your question. People didn't understand what Kabbalah is. Couldn't understand, said that's a conspiration. So that's a distortion, but consumed by very interesting figures. Balzac, for example. You're going to read Balzac, you'll see Kabbalah. You're going to read Schiller, you're going to see Kabbalah in the title, which means intrigue. People were a little bit afraid. And in any case, they believe the Jews are running everything, so how do they do it? By Kabbalah. So poor people who don't have a better explanation are using the term Kabbalah in order to say that's a conspiration, that's an intrigue, and that you know that you don't have to use Kabbalah not to say the same things about the Jews. But they used also Kabbalah. That's, there's a book that was not written. The understanding of Kabbalah as conspiration and the sources, because in the 19th century is well known. How it started, I don't know exactly, because someone must read European literature in order to see when there is a certain shift toward conspiration.
There's a question there.
Good evening, first of all. Okay, so I'll try to make it quick. So basically in your presentation, you divided Godhead into certain parturitions. Now, do you mean the Sephirah? Or a number of other concepts and orders of power?
The divine powers are referred in Kabbalah by the term Sphirot.
Mm-hmm.
But the term Sphirot has so many meanings that just only one of them. But the Kabbalists use also a series of other terms in order to refer to the same divine powers, like Midot, for example, like Tearim, like a lot. But the best known is Sephirot, which means originally sphere, like in Greek, but was designed by circles. But it referred to a certain geometric vision of the divinity.
All right. Now, because my question was actually a request for clarification. Now, how to understand the term Ein Sof, the limitless?
What?
Ein Sof?
Ein Sof, yes.
So how does that join with
Ein
this?
Sof, that's the infinite, which the Kabbalists didn't invent but used a lot, which means that God is infinite. But in order to interact with us, God, he, she, however you like, concentrated a little bit in different divine powers. And that's the way they took a philosophical vision. God is infinite, it is transcendental, etc. But immediately they added, for sure, but there are divine powers which are, in a way, the revelation of the infinite to us. So, Ein Sof means simply the infinite.
All right. Thank you very much.
Okay, you know now what Kabbalah is, I'm sure.
Thank you very much, Professor Idel. Thank you.